more questions you have, the better the session will be. And some of you might be wondering, since this is a forum about race more than just talk, why would I have a guest who is an expert in environmental anthropology? But I have a feeling once you meet Dr. Cairns, you will be as impressed with her background and her knowledge around how the environment impacts decisions that get made and can lead to structural racism and that type of thing. So let me go ahead and introduce to you who my guest is today. Dr. Mary Ann Cairns is an assistant professor of anthropology at Southern Methodist University, where she is the recipient of multiple teaching awards, including the SMU Rotunda Outstanding Professor Award and the Extra Mile Award, which is awarded to professors who support students who learn differently. Dr. Cairns is an environmental anthropologist dedicated to using creative research design and cultural understanding to safeguard environmental resources and human health. Her work has examined the politics of water and sanitary system design and development, the impacts of tourism on the impact of tourism on coastal water quality and human health, and the viability of low-cost technologies to treat wastewater polluted rivers. Her newest research has a focus on waste from the fashion industry from an interdisciplinary perspective. Dr. Cairns has led major research investigations in multiple world regions, including Latin America, the Caribbean, Western Balkans, and the United States. She is a previous recipient of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, and was recently awarded a Fulbright U.S. Scholar Fellowship for her research in North Macedonia. Dr. Cairns has served on the National Board of the Anthropology and Environment Society. Her work has been published in several major interdisciplinary journals, including Environmental Science and Technology and World Development. I became intrigued with Dr. Cairns' research because it relates to decisions that leaders make about communities. And I thought that her background is such an important aspect for all of us to have a better understanding of how decisions about the environment and decisions about the community impacts certain people in particular. So certain marginalized groups, Black people, as this focus has been on race. And so I just knew that this was going to be a wonderful conversation, and she and I have chatted several times. So I have way more questions than we have time for, but I first want to say, welcome, Mary Ann, and give you a chance just to say hello. And then I'll jump right into my first question for you.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much for having me here. I'm really honored to be able to have this conversation with you. It's been a pleasure getting to know you. And I can't wait to talk about the environment and humans. It's my favorite thing, so.
Wonderful, great, great. So my first question is, what exactly is environmental anthropology and what drew you to this area of expertise?
Absolutely. So anthropologists study humans, and environmental anthropologists study the relationship between humans and the environment. So essentially, what I am looking at is big resources like water and waste. They end up polluted, right? Humans make those decisions, and then we have to figure out a way to live with those resources, access those resources, and hopefully clean them up, right? So I always joke, I'm like, pretty much I study why people pollute things and how to clean it up. So that's really what my research is about. And Lenora, you give me such a nice intro. It's true, I have projects that focus on tourism and wastewater in coastal regions. I'm looking at waste from the fashion industry. But essentially, this has given me an opportunity to see how human groups, how culture how politics and how environments interact all over the world. So.
All over, all those pieces. So I want to do some level setting here. I've heard the terms from talking to you and then also doing some other research, green space, blue space, and how you define socio-environmental issues.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've had a few conversations, and I think, I'll be sure to define anything that I use that's jargony, or I try not to use jargon, but when I do, I define it. But I think as we're getting started, there's a few things to kind of consider, right? And I always ask people, if we're going to have a conversation about humans and the environment, first I want you to think about, okay, what comes to your mind when you hear the word nature? Is it some cordoned off, national park, or is it the weed that's growing through the crack in your parking lot, right? So kind of thinking about what nature is and how you conceptualize it and how that might be influenced by your culture, right? So, people in Bolivia, where I did some research, they think of the environment as their mother, right? They're very connected to it, whereas we in the United States often use the term it when we refer to the environment. So that's a big thing. Green space and blue space are a piece of that. So when we think about the things that we interact with the environment, and what we think about green space refers to like parks and lawns and things like this. Green space, green, think trees, think grass, right? And blue space refers to water, right? So when we think about access to resources, green space and blue space are things that, have been shown to have effects on people's quality of life, on their mental health, et cetera. And I think when I conceptualize socio-environmental issues, I identify as a political ecologist, which means I don't think you can talk about the environment without talking about the politics that created that environment. So humans have been affecting the environment for years and years, right? And so you can't say a sentence like the land was degraded without telling me who degraded the land. And so when we're kind of thinking about these things, I want to think about them politically, but I also think about them as very interactive. So it's not just that the environment makes us who we are, or we make the environment what it is. It's kind of this circular relationship.
So many of you on the call have known me a long time and know the term I use so frequently, which is a Zulu proverb, Ubuntu. And Ubuntu means I am because we are. We are because I am. And as I listen to what it is you do, it seems to me that it brings to life yet again, in a way that I hadn't thought about before, the meaning of Ubuntu, because it's the environment and people, and we interact with each other. Can you give us some examples? Well, I know you can. Will you give us some examples of decisions people make, particularly in corporations or governments or whatever, where maybe on the surface to that corporation or to that government, it seemed to make sense, but it had negative impact on people?
Absolutely. So I love that proverb. I love the way that you explain that. And I truly believe really, major points about the environment are that if you tug on any one piece of the environment, you're going to affect the rest of it, right? So water flows, pollution flows, all of these things are connected. And so I think a lot of times corporations can conceptualize, well, I'm just accessing, for instance, in the United States, fracking, right? I'm just accessing this natural gas, but it does affect water, right? It affects people in the surrounding areas. And so there's no real way to divorce one tiny resource within their, I guess natural gas isn't tiny, but one resource within the environment from all of the other surrounding areas. And there's lots of different examples of this. So one of the ones that I use in my class, and a couple of my students are here, hi guys, it's an example from Papua New Guinea. And there was this mountain that was very sacred to people. It was very important to them. And a corporation came in and mined copper out of that mountain. And it affected their spiritual lives. It polluted their water. It affected their well-being. It changed the way social relationships worked because it gave jobs to certain people and not to others. So, you can't say that the environment is not connected to every other piece of culture, right? I think in the United States, there are a lot of examples. I think Flint, Michigan comes to mind for a lot of people, right? And so water resources are a key way to kind of think of this. But when we think about infrastructure, another thing that I really looked into is infrastructure. So any choice about infrastructure that helps us access water or helps us access energy, right? Those things can really affect the populations that live within those spaces.
Mhm.
More detail.
And so, what got me started on being interested in your work, and then thinking about, and how can we get this out to more people so they can make better decisions, is for several years ago in Greensboro, we had a program called Impact Greensboro. And the ultimate outcome of the program was to create change agents. Although the focus from the learning and development perspective was diversity and inclusion and leadership, and it was 6 or 8 months, something like that, and people from various walks of life would attend. They could attend for free, but they had to apply for it because we really wanted to have very diverse groups. And I happened to be one of the facilitators for the group that was focused on economics. And to make a long story short, this was just before the leaders in Greensboro were going to make a decision about whether or not to have a waste management plant, I think reopened actually in one part of Greensboro. And because it costs so much money for the city to send our waste someplace else. And on the surface, it seemed like, well, this makes so much sense. Let's just do it right here. But because some of the leaders had participated in Impact Greensboro and started to think about how their decisions impact, in this case, Black people who lived in that neighborhood, they rethought, well, how would this impact the people who live there? How will it displace their homes? Will we employ any of them? I mean, they really started thinking about all those various things that a lot of times don't get thought about at all. And they ultimately decided not to open the waste plant. But from a diversity and inclusion perspective, what I was thrilled to read about when I heard their final decisions is they came up with a better idea. So meaning it was an idea that still saved the money, saved the city a lot of money, without having to displace all these people and ruin the environment in the area. And in my own sessions, what I talk about is doing much of this work is ultimately to get to diversity of thought. When you have diverse people thinking from different perspectives, you'll come up with a better solution than you would have if everybody was just about, what's the bottom line. And so certainly the examples you share are doing that same thing. It's when corporations are only making decisions based on how much money it's going to make them, they're not really, with great intention, at least it appears, they're not thinking about the ultimate impact. And there are so many, it's not just one or two. Have you, in your work, had the opportunity to talk to corporate decision makers, city government, state government, so that they understand this, and maybe it can have an impact on their decisions as well? If so, then please share with us some examples.
Yes, absolutely. And I really love everything that you just said. Including the community in those decisions is really vital. So, there's couple of things that we talk about: environmental justice, so making sure that everyone has equitable access to resources, but then also there is clear environmental racism in this country where not everybody has a seat at the table to make those decisions, and some people are left out. So the Superfund sites, if you look up Superfund sites, those are very polluted areas in the United States, and a lot of times those track along racial, ethnic, class-based, and other lines. So those are key issues. In my work, I'm very lucky to have had the opportunity to really speak with a lot of different groups. So one of the things that I really try to do is try to involve multiple layers of society when I'm kind of thinking about these issues. Individuals within communities, decision makers in those communities, local governments, national governments, NGOs, and that's something that I really try to replicate a lot across a lot of different areas. And I think also the lab that I have and the students and the trainees that I work with, we work very hard to have an inclusive and diverse lab for the exact reason that you just said, which is you do better science when you have a diverse team, right? So it's really important to have that cadre of different views. I can give a couple of clear examples of the ways that I've created those relationships. So I was at the EPA before I started at SMU in Dallas. I was hosted at the EPA as part of the AAAS fellowship that you told people about earlier. And the project that we did was actually funded by President Bush back in the 90s. But we worked with the 6 communities in the Western Balkans, or the 6 countries in the Western Balkans that hadn't yet joined the EU. And we helped to kind of give advice on environmental priorities related to water management and other issues. And so that was including 18 different municipalities, people from NGOs and the government in those different areas. And one of the big questions was, how do you get people who share water, kind of waterways, right? The river goes from one country to the other, but there's a country boundary right through it, right? And so that's a really interesting question. Other places where I've done that are in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, right? There's wastewater everywhere. It's going to keep me in a job for a while, I think. So Cape Cod, Massachusetts, one of the things there was like really working with local agencies and local governments, thinking about, okay, basically they were thinking about putting in alternative wastewater treatment systems. Which ones are going to work? Which ones are going to work for the community? Which ones are actually going to be effective? We studied eco toilets, believe it or not. It didn't work out for that community, and there were lots of different reasons, but one of the biggest ones was like the retrofit didn't work in those old houses in Cape Cod. It was really expensive and difficult to do the retrofit. So there are a lot of different things in that, and I think unless you get everybody to the table, you're not going to make a good decision about an environmental resource.
So I'm going to back up a little bit because, on 2 things. First, tell folks what Superfund sites are,
Yes.
and then I'll ask you the other question.
Okay, so I can actually put in the chat too a link to the US EPA and the Superfund sites. But essentially the Superfund program is responsible for cleaning up some of our nation's most contaminated land. And this can correlate to things like oil spills or natural disasters. Lots of different things, a lot of corporations that had spills, et cetera, et cetera. There are tons and tons and tons of these sites. I guarantee there's one of these sites near you. You can actually put in where you're at and it will show you ones near you. Can't remember, but I think Texas has like 40, right? So one of my students just did some work on this, and I think she said that 4.1 million people live within a 4-mile radius of a Superfund site. So I'm gonna put this in the chat real quick, and I encourage everybody to look at that. But that is what Superfund is.
Mm-hmm. And if you live near a Superfund site, talk to me about how depending on which one it is, how that correlates to Black kids in particular having asthma.
Yeah.
Example.
So there are tons of diverse sites. And so I'm going to just talk about an article that I really love to discuss with my students that I think really clearly identifies this. So in Houston, Texas, there is a community that's right by a factory that pumps a bunch of particulate matter into the air. And people in that area have a lot higher rates of asthma and a lot higher rates of other negative health outcomes. And, I think one thing that happens when people talk about environmental problems is they try to individualize it, right? They're like, well, if you've got asthma, clean up your house. Well, if you've got asthma, make sure you don't have roaches. Well, if you've got, and, there's this really kind of poignant and moving part of this article. It's called Breathless in Houston. I can also send that to you and you can provide it to people on your website. But, where somebody's like, look, I don't have asthma because I individually didn't keep my house clean. I don't have asthma because I'm Black. I have asthma because I live next to this, factory that is pumping stuff into my air. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the pieces of confusion sometimes when we look at health outcomes as based on race or ethnicity. It can look as if, those are causal things, but it doesn't mean that if you're part of a group, you're more likely to get, it's a cultural thing that places people in harm's way. Mm-hmm. So if we start thinking about the structures and the societal issues that place people in harm's way, you can start looking at those health outcomes a little bit more holistically, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not causal. You're not more likely to get asthma because you are, phenotypically or physically part of a certain group. You're more likely to get it because of the sociocultural experience that you have within this country.
Mm-hmm. And that's where, to me, the intersect happens with systemic or structural racism. It's the decisions that get made on where some of these places are built, or and then all the things that it manifests. And then particularly people who are more socioeconomically challenged. They don't have as many options of places where they can live, so they end up having to live next to the places like that. Then they're the ones that get sick. And to compound it, those who are from the outside looking in are blaming the victim rather than all of the causality in total. One of the people that we have on the call is Valda on the call with us today, and she's a registered nurse. And so as you were talking, one of the things she wrote in the chat about, when I was asking about asthma is, arsenic and lead, and lead in the paint in some of these old homes. And so it occurred to me, it's like when you get people together from diverse perspectives, it's lots of different people in the community and the medical community and the construction people. I mean, there's so many different voices that need to be at the table in order to make more effective decisions. I mean, I always like to believe that people are they make decisions that have unintentional consequences, and they really didn't mean for that to happen. I'd like to believe that. Sometimes I'm not totally convinced, but the more voices we would have at the table around these, particularly around these big decisions, then maybe ultimately we would make better decisions that would serve everyone. So it wouldn't be just serving one population. The other question that I alluded to is that you talked about how some cultures see nature as her, where we see it as it. Talk to us about that. How does that then impact our decision making?
Yeah. Well, I think, when we think about environmental resources in this country, a lot of times certain very, I would say mainstream ideas about the environment are like, it's there for us to use so that we can get the stuff, right? Whatever it might be. We can make the things, we can make the widgets, we can get the stuff. And that is a very kind of individualistic and capitalistic way of thinking about environmental resources, right? And there are a lot of cultures that think about the environment much more collectively, right? As something that is living and breathing that we are being a part of, right? And so when we think about whether or not we're a part of nature, right? A lot of early ecological studies studied a natural area, but then divided the humans out of it, right? How's that going to work? Like, we're part of that environment, right? So, in Bolivia, I was so really influenced by their perspectives on the environment. They've actually given the rights of personhood to Mother Nature in Bolivia. And so that's a big, big deal, right? And, of course, as with so many things, it's an example of like abstract law and concrete violations at every turn, right? But there really is a different conceptualization of environment. And I think when we look at some of the kind of perspectives that undergird American life, talking about individualism, talking about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, some of these other things that are really meant to kind of define the American experience, they can be very dividing if we don't watch it. And really, what we talked about before, that, nature is connected and water flows and pollution flows, like the choice that I make about an environmental resource, right, it probably affects you. If we put a dam on a river at this point, it's going to affect people downstream. It's going to affect people maybe in other countries. I have a student that's studying the Colorado River, and the dams that we've put on the Colorado River have actually made it so that there is drought in Mexico, right? And some of the areas that used to have really good access to water don't anymore. So all of these things are really connected. And I do think that we can do a lot to kind of reconceptualize that. And one thing I wanted to just kind of reach back to that you were talking about with lead and arsenic and, air pollution, one of the big things right now in environmental science is looking at mixtures. So looking at mixtures of different pollutants, looking at mixtures of different exposures, and kind of looking at the totality of exposures over a person's lifetime. And so if you start thinking about that and the way that exposures can be compounded for certain groups who are put in harm's way by the structures of the way that the US works, like that really can be a powerful way to think about differential health outcomes and differential access to environmental and other resources.
And so given our current political environment, we have a lot of work to do to help people trust science again. So if you're going to look at different mixtures, then you also have to get people to believe that this is evidence that is not politically based. I mean, with all the things that all the commercials and people on newscasts that are specifically talking to African American doctors and nurses who have taken the vaccine, and asking them why are they doing that, is because, you know, in so much of the Black culture, there is no trust, because people know about, you know, how men were treated that had syphilis, and you know, go on and on. There are just so many examples. And in one of my sessions a couple of years ago, I had a doctor who worked at one of these hospitals, not during that time, he was much too young for that, but he talked about how hard it was to get African Americans to use the hospital facilities where he was located, because 50 years ago, that hospital had done some very awful things to Black people, to research their bodies and let them die, etc. So even though some of these things have happened a very long time ago, the verbal history is definitely with us. And then in moving forward, as it relates further to the environment, there's education that has to happen. There are decisions that need to be made that are clearly communicated as not political, but rather good for the whole community. I want to take a pause for a moment, and I imagine that Jen has a few questions. So Jen, any questions for Marianne?
We do have a few questions, and one of them, the question is directed specifically as what you were talking about as far as corporations and infrastructure, but it's more to the why. And the question is, many areas where marginalized people have actual and potential negative effects from waste. In North Carolina, I see situations where runoff from pig farms affect health. But why are industries allowed to come into an area and not required to keep the environment safe?
So let's start off with the easy one, right?
Yeah. It's so important to talk about, and it's one of those things that's really complicated. I know that sounds like a lame answer to this, but it really is. And there's a lot of different things that play into this, right? It's the way that our government is structured. It's the power that certain agencies have to be able to regulate. It's the back to the precautionary principles. So, like, you know, basically in Europe, there's this thing that says you can't use a chemical unless you can prove it's healthy, right? In the US, you can't ban a chemical unless you can prove it's harmful, right? So that is one of the things that's like a key difference, right? And it's a conceptualization of you know, kind of who gets the power. When we look at how these communities are affected, a lot of times the responsibility is put on the community to show the problem and evidence the problem in a way that's legally actionable. And that can be very difficult, right? One of the things that, you know, scientists are doing to try to kind of disrupt that is to do citizen science. And that's something that gets citizens involved in science. And there's lots of different examples of that. A citizen science project was key to some of the work that was done in Flint to find the issue, if you want to look into that. So, you know, that's really important. I think, you know, scientists are at the point where, and I'm getting a little off topic, but I want to kind of circle back to that thing that you said about scientists and trusting scientists. We're really starting to work toward making sure that the questions that we ask are inclusive and diverse, right? And I think sometimes students can get a little bit off when they think about, well, you know, the science is objective, right? You study this thing, this is the outcome. But who gets to ask the questions and who gets funded to ask those questions are key. So this does relate back to what we were just talking about. So I think there really does need to be a sea change in funding more research that looks at applied problems like these issues in people's communities, right? Because a lot of times traditional funding mechanisms won't necessarily fund that community-based work. It won't fund a year's worth of communication with that community to have a really great project that's really inclusive, right? So that's a key piece too. So the research kind of realm is implicated in why those people aren't able to have a voice, right? The way our government is structured is implicated in that, right? We have all of these different agencies like the EPA, but they're funded by budgets that are decided by certain areas. And a lot of times those budgets can end up really political. So, you know, the EPA, I'm sure, would love to regulate every single, you know, company out there. But in reality, they usually only have money to kind of regulate and really check in on and double check like 3%. I mean, there's lots of different examples of these percentages and they change over time. But that's really key. And then also, you know, when we look at society, who ends up with a seat at the table? Who gets taken seriously, right? Scientists get taken seriously by a lot of people. Sometimes they don't. But who gets to be at that table and who gets to have a voice? So all of those things are implicated in that problem. And it's really, I could talk about it all day.
So one thing that comes to mind is a phrase that we hear often, but I don't know how seriously people take it, which is all politics are local. So if we're wanting to have a voice in some of these things, then we really need to think about who are we voting for to sit at the table locally on some of those parts of local government that doesn't get a lot of attention, but they make critically important important decisions. And the other thing that occurred to me as you were explaining that is the way it's approached in the US means you have to already have a problem before you can even raise it to the level of examination to fix it, rather than the reverse in some other countries where they have to prove it doesn't harm. We have to prove it did harm, but that means it's got to be out there and harm in the first place, which seems backwards, but you know, I can understand it.
I agree. It seems backwards. I agree with you completely. Yeah.
Absolutely. So Jen, we got another question. I have more that I'll ask Marianne, but I want to make sure that we get the questions in that are coming in from our viewers.
Well, I hesitate to ask after that explanation, but in follow-up, can we trust our drinking water?
Okay, so I'm so glad you asked this question. I think sometimes we can hear about areas where there are, you know, spills or where there is toxic waste, and we hear about Flint, and sometimes that can erode public confidence in infrastructure, right? And in reality, the US has some of the best drinking water all over the world. We're so lucky to have access to safe drinking water that just comes out of the tap. Like, we are so used to having access to that amazing resource that we literally flush it down the toilet. Like 30% of our drinking water goes right down the toilet if you think about household water use. So we are so lucky to have that. And I think this is another area where that collective kind of consciousness comes in, right? Don't take these I would encourage you not to take these examples and issues as reason to kind of divorce yourself from these common good resources, like municipal water systems, like municipal wastewater systems, because those are common goods that people rely on, right? If anything, those issues should make us double down on supporting those resources that we are relying on, right? Water, energy, etc. Like, we all benefit when everybody has safe water, right? We all benefit when everybody has access to the resources that they need. So I do think we need to make sure that, you know, while we deal with these issues, and they're extremely important to deal with, still remember that those common good resources and those infrastructures can be trusted and are very reliable. And I have an article on that, and I can send it to you, and maybe you can put it on your website too.
Great, thank you. Well, and one of the ways that our behavior within our society shifts is when kids in elementary school learn about this information. Obviously not quite in the way that you presented it, but you know, making it age relatable. When kids come home and say to their parents or guardians, we've got to recycle, and oh no, that doesn't go in that pail, it needs to go in another pail, that at least helps. But then even with recycling, I think sometimes, you know, some people don't recycle at all. And then at least in Greensboro, we have two different bins to put trash in. And so often I see things that are in the recycling bin that aren't supposed to be there based on what's listed. And I'm thinking, well, that's costing us more money. For the person who maybe didn't know wasn't supposed to go into that bin, that's costing more money because somebody on the other end, or machine or whatever, they got to take the energy to run the machine, has got to take out the things that aren't recyclable. So we need to constantly be learning what are the things that we can do on an everyday basis. A friend of mine who lives in a different state, but here in the US, she and her husband don't flush the toilet every time when it's just number one. I won't get into all the details, but they don't flush the toilet all the time. And when she first told me that, I'm like, really? And she said, because it wastes too much water. And when you think about it, that's true. So another comparison of how we treat things here in the US versus in many other countries. And whenever I'm traveling in international airports, in Europe in particular is where I see it, where you push one button if you need this much water and the other button if you need that much water, instead of just flushing the whole thing. And I think too often we just don't think about those everyday resources that that we could preserve, and water is becoming more and more a precious commodity based on the things that I've been reading. So we need to all, we are in other circumstances, as we're talking about social unrest, we're saying silence is not acceptable. It seems to me, as it relates to this type of conversation, silence is not acceptable either. We need to continue to educate ourselves. So I've got another question for you, and this one has to do with the impact of food deserts, location of bus depots. I think you kind of touched on that without specifically talking about depots themselves, but the exhausts that give out and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, food deserts, waste management plants, etc., how those environmental things have an impact on people in usually lower socioeconomic groups. It has an impact in more than just the air they breathe. So can you talk a little bit more, particularly around food deserts?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this gets back to a couple things that we were talking about. And one thing that I always tell my students is, like, no matter where you end up, the wastewater treatment plant is always in the poor neighborhood. It's always in the Black neighborhood. It's always in a neighborhood that is not the people in power, right? And I work in a lot of different countries, and that's true pretty much everywhere. There are a lot of problems with that kind of access. I will say, when it comes to water, wastewater treatment works, right? You can treat water that is waste, and then all of a sudden it becomes drinkable again. So we do have those technologies, and those technologies are important. As far as specifically kind of how it affects those different groups, we were talking about food deserts, we were talking about a lot of different environmental considerations, but like, if people don't have access to the resources they need within the place that they live, right? You can't then put individual responsibility on them for the negative environmental and health impacts from those things, right? Of course, all of it's related. Of course, we should try to recycle and put it in the right bin, right? But at the same time, if you live in a place where there's no access to safe food, to define a food desert is an area where people don't have access to groceries or fresh fruits and vegetables, but rather are reliant on things like 7-Elevens, convenience stores, fast food, right, to be able to get food. And my hometown in Richmond, Indiana, has practically become that over the past several years. And so, there's a grocery store all the way over here or all the way over here, but you really don't get to go there unless you have a car, right? So those kinds of things keep people from being able to access those resources that they need, right? And that can lead to things like obesity. And that can lead to things like, heart disease, et cetera. I'm sure the nurse who was on the call could jump in there and tell me all kinds of things about it. But that is a structural problem, right? To blame somebody who is stuck within those spaces for those negative health outcomes is to ignore an entire structural kind of force that is putting them in harm's way. So I think that really goes back to that relationship. And the same thing where, oh, you should have known, oh, you should have treated your water differently, oh, you should have boiled it, et cetera, right? Or I assign a study in Alaska, right? And there is a place in Alaska where the infrastructure is so difficult to access because of snow and ice and all of these other things that people have to go to a place called a washateria, and it's like $5 per shower, right? And then they really don't have enough income to support that infrastructure and be able to pay those taxes. Like, come on, right? You set them up a little bit. So it's not right to think of those things as disconnected and to think of it as individual responsibility to be able to move within a space that has been kind of designed to put them in harm's way.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, given the challenges that so many people are dealing with right now because of the pandemic and losing their jobs and having to figure out a way to take care of their kids, let alone educate them, who have not had to think about that before. I wonder, will there be a shift in thinking at all? Because this is impacting millions of people. I wonder, might there be a shift at all as some of the people I just described, because they can't afford to put gas in their car, they are having to walk to a Circle K or a 7-Eleven or, and, you know, buy whatever food they can. And when they get back to, you know, on the other side of this pandemic, when they get back to working, I wonder, will there be a higher level sensitivity? I'm sure somebody will be out there doing some research on that, to see. I hope that there will be some type of a mind shift, because it takes a lot of voices for then the communities and the corporations to listen and make some decisions differently. Jen, do we have any more questions coming in?
We do. So here's a question. In social sciences, participatory research has come into being to democratize how research happens. In environmental science, is this practice also used?
Yeah, so I love this question, and I love participatory research. And I think certainly social scientists have been working toward that. So just kind of the way that I conceptualize participatory research, one thing to think about is like community-based participatory research. And that means that the community is in on the question asking, not just the research, right? So you work with the community to be like, all right, what needs to be researched here? And then everybody kind of comes together and does it. And then from then on, you continue to keep the community as a part of that discussion, right? So it's really co-created. My studies, I will say, I make every effort to have that kind of a model. You know, the work that we do in Costa Rica right now, we've got people from the National Water Lab, we've got people from the local municipality, we've got people from the community, and we make sure that we think about that from the beginning of the project and how it was designed and set up to the publications, right? We have local scholars on publications that we publish in the United States, because it's crappy to be one of those scientists that goes into another country, does a bunch of work, and then doesn't include people on your publications. But anyway, is that happening in environmental science more broadly? I think this goes back to what I was talking about, that it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, a lot of money, a lot of times to do that kind of research. And so until the funding agencies and until people in charge of like kind of making science move forward are starting to respect that to the same extent the scientists who are doing the work are respecting it, it's going to be difficult to get whole disciplines to make that change. I will say the environmental scientists and the engineers that I work with, I love them, right? We start from a place that's so different. We have different language. I literally was talking to a biologist that I work with for 2 hours. We were arguing, and then at the end of it, we realized we were saying the exact same thing the whole time, right? So sometimes it can be difficult to like get to those points. But I think as we start doing more interdisciplinary work and including lots of different people in these things, I always tell people, like, go find an anthropologist where you're working, go find a sociologist, go find a social scientist and put them on your engineering project. Like, you know, have them there from the beginning. Don't just call me at the end to do the community engagement. That's crap. Bring me in from the beginning, right? So I do think there needs to be a lot more there. And I love that question. And I'm glad I got to talk.
Back to diversity of thought, getting more people involved. I worked for General Motors many, many years ago. And it was, when I left, it was right at the beginning stages where they had recognized that trying to build a car by one department at a time didn't make sense. So they started building they started bringing together what they call platform teams. And so you'd have an engineer, you'd have the marketing person, you'd have, you know, like every different part of what you have to think about in making totally the car work, not just building it, but selling it and everything else. They had voices at the table. And then the quality of their cars started changing. What a surprise. But they had to figure that out. And Jen, I happened to look in chat and saw that Jolene asked a question as well. If you would read that question to us.
Absolutely. To help me be aware of sustainability, I look to the phrases zero waste, circular economy. What are 3 resources you can suggest to us for small things we can personally do around your topic?
I love that question. Thank you. Certainly, there are a lot of different kind of movements, right? Kind of thinking about, okay, zero waste. How can you get down to the lowest amount of waste that you have? Circular economy. How can you make something cradle to grave? Like, you'll hear kind of all of these buzzwords, but I think what's really important to consider is, what are you able to do for the environment? So I always tell my students, I'm not sitting here a perfect environmentalist. That's crappy, right? I'm a scientist. I go to 2 conferences a year. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I'm holier than everybody else. I'm doing the best that I can. And I think it's important to think about, okay, what am I able to do in the space that I'm in? what kind of steps can I take? I'm not going to sit here and tell all of you that you have to use reusable straws or some of these other things, because I think, you know, one of the biggest, I would say, one of the biggest problems, that's how I'll say it, is that, you know, corporations and certain people and certain groups are responsible for like the lion's share of the environmental problems that we're facing right now. So if we're looking at climate change and we're looking at these things, it's industrialized nations, it's the West, right? It's certain people and certain corporations that have made those things happen, right? So you as an individual, I want you to know you should make every effort that you can, but like, even if all of us never use a straw again, it's not going to fix the problem. So I do want us to be thinking about the structural and the individual. As far as individual things that you can do, I'll give you a few that just come up off the top of my head. When you're thinking about what you bring into your home, I really like to think about source reduction before I think about things like, you know, recycling and things like that, because if you make a good choice about what you bring into your home and what you use personally, that's a big deal. So I told you I'm doing that fashion project, right? All about waste from the fashion industry. I encourage you to think about, can I borrow it? Can I get something used? Can I share something? Do I need this thing? If I need this thing, can I get it from a company that makes sustainable pieces? My jacket is used, right? Okay, so like those kinds of things are huge. So think about source reduction. Other things that you can do individually, back to the vote thing, I hemmed and hawed over, I'm not kidding, the superintendent of schools, what was it? I don't know what, the school board elections. Like I hemmed and hawed for like a whole day. Like I read every article I could find about those two people. So I think really being thoughtful about who's in the smaller, that's a difficult thing. The more local, we'll say it that way, things, the more local elected positions, that's another thing that you can do. And then just talk to people about the environment, talk to people about how these things are connected, right? Be thoughtful about what you bring into your home, but also be generous and I would say give people grace for what they're able to do. So one of the stories that I usually tell students when they're asking me this is when I was in grad school, there were two women in my department who were pregnant. One of them was wealthier and had a husband. One of them was less wealthy and her husband was abroad. They were, she was in the United States, don't need to get into that. But anyway, she essentially was a single parent in the US. And the one student in grad school chewed out the other one for shopping at Walmart and using disposable diapers. And I thought that was the most obtuse thing I had ever seen in my whole life, and it drove me insane, right? So don't do stuff like that, right? The answer is not that everybody uses reusable diapers. The answer is that everybody is working toward making sure people are aware of all of the different structural issues that affect our environment and take whatever personal steps they are able to take within their spaces.
Well, there's lots of ideas there. And actually, I was going to ask you that question anyway. So Jolene, thank you for asking. So I've got two more questions. And I'll go with the most important one first in case we run out of time, because I am sensitive to time as well. And well, I shouldn't say most important, the one that I think most people will certainly be interested in. And that is this. You're currently looking at the impact of COVID-19 and the impact on the environment as it relates to children. Mm-hmm. What have you learned so far?
Yeah, so I'm part of an international society called the International Society for Children's Health and the Environment. And it is a group of amazing scientists from all over the world. And I'm just one of many who is kind of looking into this and thinking this through. But we've just put out, we've just submitted an article, it's not out yet, but we just submitted an article to a journal that looks at just how children's lives are changing because of the pandemic, right? And certainly follow public health advice, trust scientists in those spaces, right? But at the same time, we do need to think about what has changed. And one of the big points of that article is COVID didn't cause food insecurity, right? COVID essentially just uncovered already existing inequalities and problems in our society that, you know, were there all along, but all of a sudden, people act like are brand new, right? COVID is not the causal factor. COVID is something that uncovered, like essentially years and years of historical and kind of local and systemic problems that are affecting children. And so when we think about all of those different pieces, right, it shouldn't be that COVID came about and all of a sudden X% of people within communities were food insecure because they weren't able to access that through schools, right? Let's think about creating a space where those structures are not so fragile that they quote unquote break under the impact of that, right? I also think, you know, we conceptualize exposure very broadly, right? We think about, okay, people are in indoor environments more often. We think about, you know, all of a sudden kids don't have access to schools. One of the things that's happening in Dallas, I have a friend who works for DISD, which is the local kind of school system, and there are tons and tons of kids who have not gone to a single day of online courses, right? They're really not able to access those courses. And let's think about the structural things that put them in harm's way there. You can't think about environmental exposure without thinking about all of the other social and cultural things that are putting those kids in harm's way at the beginning. And I think just, you know, a quick shout out to my students. We just put out a piece on COVID and connection and loneliness and kind of how people relate during these times. And I think now more than ever, it's really important to think about the humanistic and the social and the relational. Think about how we can be of help to one another and how we can handle things collectively. But at the same time, let's bat down all of that crap that was already there that put people in harm's way. That's what I would say.
Well, certainly there are many things that, to your point, people either weren't paying attention to or didn't think was there, and now COVID has uncovered it, has pulled the curtain back. Whenever I'm working with clients that are in the medical community, the healthcare professionals, where before, when I would present some of the research that I have, which I'm not a medical professional, but the research I have as it relates to diversity and inclusion, sometimes they would be surprised and nice to know. Now they're like really on it because there has been so much attention given to the medical community in so many ways, especially as it relates to Black people, as it relates to marginalized people, whether they're Black or not. And so that's a good thing that at least we're looking at it and trying to find some solutions. So Jen, I'm going to go to you one more time, see if you have a question, and then I will ask my last question.
The last question we had, I think you actually sort of just answered, to be honest, because it was how important is recycling really? And I think you kind of just played on that just now.
I think so too. So
Yeah.
Of some, but as
Go
part
ahead.
of a longer effort, that's all I would say.
Yeah, you can't do everything, but do what you can.
And we
So
also have a request for resources in the follow-up, and I know that we'll be including that with the recording. So
yes, definitely. So your latest research you touched on it briefly. Your latest research has to do with the fashion industry and the environment. So talk to us a little bit more about that. And then we will wrap. I've got one more thing to request of you, and then we'll call it a wrap.
Absolutely. So this study is really fun. I'm excited about it. Essentially, clothing is a basic need for humanity, but fashion is a bombshell source of pollution. It is just a huge source of pollution. So fashion is responsible for a great percentage of industrial wastewater worldwide. It's responsible for a lot of our landfill space. And essentially, you know, this study is looking at why people buy things, why they throw them away, how they throw them away, the impacts to the environment. It's meant to be really big picture, getting a lot of people to the table thinking about these issues. I just submitted a grant proposal that will hopefully fund some of that work, but we've got a lot of things going already. I've got a couple studies at SMU that include my students, shout out Chanel, who's working with me on that project, really looking at why people make decisions that they do, how we might be more sustainable individually, but it's also something that we want to look at globally.
Well, as I listen to all of the insights you've just shared with us, I certainly can make several connections to structural racism, broadly speaking. And so much of it has to do with our environment that, you know, maybe people haven't necessarily thought about before. I hope that there will be folks that are going to listen to this and take notes and take action. I know several people, based on the questions they've been asking and the things that are in chat, are interested in learning more. We will put some resources along with the video. But if people want to reach out to you or learn more about some of your studies, what would be the best way for them to reach you?
Well, please do. So we are on Instagram it's at the Cairns Lab, and I can send that, or I can just put it in the chat here in a second. And also you're welcome to email me. You can look up my website. I think that Lenora put that on the flyer. So feel free to look at the website. That has a contact us button. You know, academics love it when people want to talk about their research. Like, you know, you, my mom, like, I'll be so excited if you guys want to talk about it. I love talking about environmental problems. This is really, you know, somebody asked me what my mission in life was. I was like, I want to teach people how to save the earth. That's really like, I love it. I would be happy to talk to every single one of you. I will say I am just one of a ton of amazing scientists who work within this realm. So thank you for having me here. But, you know, it's definitely a group effort, and they're amazing scientists if there's something specific that I can refer you to. So.
Well, it absolutely was my pleasure. I am so thrilled that the universe brought us together in the first place so we could learn more about what we each do, and that you were willing to spend some time with us this afternoon. So again, I'll remind you that our next Zoom forum is going to be on January 14th. We will talk about lots of different ways to have critical conversations. And my guest will be Tracy Brown, who is a trailblazer in the space of diversity, inclusion, and equity, who also happens to live in Texas, by the way. And so she and I will answer your questions and share information, etc. So please join us once again. When you get the invitation, when you get the information, send it out to additional people. I'm loving doing this as long as it is being done where we feel like people are finding useful information. And so far, the feedback that I've gotten has been very positive. So we'll do more even after Tracy. Marianne, thank you so much for being with us today. It has just been a joy. I have learned so much, and I'm sure all the folks that are on the Zoom call have learned as well. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so
Safe
much.
holidays. Happy Kwanzaa. Merry Christmas. Let's see. Merry Christmas, Kwanzaa, Hanukkah, and Happy New Year, or just have a good time. See you next year. Bye-bye.